Doug Ford, a liberal, a conservative, something in the middle? Stick around. We're going to get into it. This is On the Line. For hundreds of communities across Canada, forestry is a lifeline, supporting 200,000 workers, $87 billion in annual revenues, and $37 billion in exports, $29 billion to the United States. But it's more than just a driver of our economy. It's key to addressing some of our biggest challenges. We need an action plan for our forest sector and its employees, one that will help build the homes we need with Canadian wood, reduce the risk of wildfires, and create more family-supporting jobs right here at home. To learn more about what forestry can do for Canada, visit forestryforthefuture.ca. Hey, it's Matt Gurney. This is the latest episode of On the Line. And despite what you might be thinking when you hear my voice, it's actually Jen's episode. Her conversation was recorded a little bit ago, just in case she would not be back from a trip she was taking in time. And guess what? She's not back in time from the trip she was taking. So here now, Jen Gerson with Matt Spoke of Project Ontario, a grassroots group of small C conservatives in Ontario who are starting to wonder, what is up with Doug Ford? And is he actually a conservative?
Well, today we have with us Matt Spoke from Project Ontario. Matt, can you please explain to me a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jen. It's a pleasure. Well, as you'd imagine, I'm based in Ontario. I'm one of the early contributors in a project that was launched right before the summer in sort of the late spring called Project Ontario. The way we describe ourselves is a group of small C Ontario conservatives who feel like we should be getting more out of our current PC government and have put our heads together to start proposing policy ideas, start to provide a little bit of, let's say, opposition to a government that right now doesn't face a lot of opposition at Queen's Park, all with a view towards improving outcomes for Ontarians. So that's how this started. It's obviously evolving as we've been writing and getting reactions and feedback, different people that want to see different things out of what we've been building. But that was the origins of Project Ontario.
Okay, so I think this is following on conversations that I've certainly heard in private among conservative people who are increasingly disillusioned by the fact that Doug Ford, who, of course, came to power, how many years ago now?
7.5 years.
Oh, 7.5 years ago?
2020 or February 2018, if I'm not mistaken, something in that range.
Yeah. And I think he came to power amid a lot of hope and optimism that the end of the Ontario Liberal era, the Wynne era, the McGuinty era was behind everyone. And there was an expectation that a conservative premier would be a pretty conservative premier. I mean, if I recall, I remember taking a lot of shit online from people on the left who heralded Doug Ford as the beginning of some kind of authoritarian conservative rule in Ontario. Hasn't really panned out that way, has it? Not only has he proven to be a pretty, I think, is weak leader a right thing? Maybe I'm being a bit too loaded with this. He's been a pretty, let's just say, I wouldn't describe him as a strong man.
I think that's a fair way to say. Yeah,
I think that's fair to say. Fair to say that Doug Ford has not proven many strongman predictions terribly accurate. But I've also heard a lot of complaints from conservatives who are like, this guy ain't even all that conservative. He's not following any of the things that we would like to see done in Ontario from a conservative ideological perspective. So let's get into that. How has Doug Ford not been a conservative?
Well, it's funny. I think one of the fear factors that always gets paraded around in the media and on the left when a conservative gets elected is that there's some sort of hidden agenda that they didn't tell the electorate about, and after they come into power, they're going to roll out this massively conservative. And I think the reality with Doug Ford has been the complete opposite. The hidden agenda was incredibly.
He did have a hidden agenda. The hidden agenda was to come to power.
Like the Liberals, right? That was the hidden agenda.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
So I mean, we started down this path wanting to keep this relatively objective and not not too much of a shot at individuals in this government, but really just looking at outcomes in the province. And 7.5 years into a government, you can't really say that they haven't had time to implement a policy agenda. So we can look at things like, how are things going? How is the economy doing? How are wait times in healthcare doing? How are outcomes in education looking? And there are objective metrics, either based on public polling or based on just verifiable measurable metrics like economic growth and things like that. And we can start to see a trend line. Have things gotten better or worse across major policy areas in the province since this government took office, including as basic as how much are we spending as a government compared to what were our predecessors spending? And across many of these metrics, it's not even a contentious thing to say we are doing worse as a province today. Our GDP growth is lower than the national average. In fact, we're among the lowest in the country. Wait times have gotten worse in the province in our healthcare system. At the education system, I think, we're seeing some early signs from Minister Calandra that they're trying to take control back from some school boards, but school boards have sort of been like running rampant since COVID with all sorts of interesting and sort of wild agendas. And so I think there's a whole bunch of areas. I mean, housing is an area that I work in on a day-to-day basis, where we are now the slowest province as it relates to housing starts and housing completions in the country, even though most analysts would look at Ontario as the root cause of the housing problem in the country. And so we just have objective metrics that suggest that we are not doing the right things, or at least we're not getting the right outcomes. And so whatever policy prescriptions this government has been attempting to use to solve these problems are just not working. And so we looked at this across a whole number of policy files. I think there's a dozen plus areas that we could get into and nitpick on, but really I think it is all underpinned by a lack of definition as to what does this government believe, what do they stand for, what are the principles that anchor their decision making. And from our perspective, there doesn't seem to be a very clear set of principles that help them make decisions on how to govern the province, and it's just leading to unfortunate outcomes for people in the province.
All right, well, let's dig into a couple of those areas. I'm very interested in spending. I'm very interested in economics. I'm very interested in education, but, I have a self-interested reason to be interested in that right now. And I'm interested in maybe potentially even healthcare. But let's first frame that conversation. This is mostly going to be a podcast intended for a national audience. So I want to frame this by saying, what happens in Ontario, because Ontario is just so big, I think is relevant to the rest of the country.
Absolutely.
So let's keep it top level on that. I mean, if Ontario's economy collapses, for example, there is no province, including my own of Alberta, that's going to go about or be unscathed by that. So I think it's relevant to discuss some of that stuff, even if it is provincially specific. But firstly, the other thing I want to point out is a lot of the metrics that you're describing are Canada-wide metrics. Can we really blame the Ontario government, whether it's PC or Liberal, for a lot of these issues around high spending, declining economies, collapsing institutions, these sorts of problems, higher crime, whatever, when I'm seeing the exact same thing in Edmonton that you're seeing in Toronto?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair question. And naturally, if this were a smaller province, then I'd say you'd be able to put the lion's share of the blame or the explanation at the foot of the federal government. But as you mentioned, Ontario is not only the largest in terms of population, it's the largest in terms of its economic contributions in absolute numbers to the country. And so that means that what Ontario does has ripple effects everywhere. I mean, I'll use housing as a very specific example. I mean, I hold this view, and I think a lot of people do as well, that housing is at the root of a lot of our economic problems. If people can't afford to live near the places they need to work, then there's a whole bunch of negative ripple effects that come out of that. And when Toronto and Ontario have a housing problem, what ends up happening is that they export that problem to places in the country that have historically been more affordable. And so, why has housing gotten more expensive in Halifax and St. John's and Burnaby?
Yeah.
To a large extent because people have been leaving Ontario to look for more affordable places elsewhere, and in the process of doing that, they bid up the value of homes in those
because
places.
Of course now they can sell their $1 million home in Toronto, and they have that much more capital to be playing with in some of these other places. That's right.
And so, and not even within the province. I mean, you go to places like London, Ontario, it's a city of 400,000 people. Now you've got a whole bunch of Toronto exports going to London, bidding up house prices and making it unaffordable for people that have historically lived in London, Ontario. But that's true nationwide. Doug Ford has definitely been the first to point out the fact that most of these problems are Mark Carney's fault, or they're Justin Trudeau's fault, or, always somebody else's fault.
Well, I mean, we in Alberta are familiar with that game.
Yeah. We do it quite well in Ontario. But I do think that all the places that we like to point the finger elsewhere, we have a lot of levers in the province's jurisdiction. I mean, you look at things like competitiveness in our business environment. Yes, the federal government levies corporate taxes, but so do the provinces, and we have a decision to make on how much should we levy taxes on corporations, or how much should we write checks in terms of like corporate handouts to EV plants or things of that nature when they're proposing to open manufacturing facilities in the province. So we do make a lot of day-to-day decisions that impact the economic outlook of the province. And I think it's sort of too convenient to just point the finger elsewhere. So yes, the country is facing a problem economically as well as across other metrics. But I do think provinces have to carry their share of the blame, particularly if you've been in office for a very long period of time during that time frame that people point to. People like to point to 2015 when Justin Trudeau came into office as the moment when everything started going sideways or downhill. I mean, we've been in office.
There's some statistical evidence for that position.
That's right. There is. But overlapping that period, I'll say 2018 to today, when the PCs have been elected at Queen's Park, is also a huge period of that decline. I mean, we saw things get worse in Ontario since Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty. And I'm not one to advocate for the return of the Liberals at Queen's Park. I just think that we have some blame to hold provincially as a PC party as well.
Well, look, I as an Albertan enjoy nothing more than talking about why things are going shit in Ontario. So let's get into that.
Okay.
Tell me about what's happened to your economy in the last 7.5 years, and how is that a continuation of the trajectory that you guys were on under the Liberal government, or have things accelerated or gotten worse under the Ford government?
Well, and I'll say one thing that's very one of our strengths in Ontario, unlike many other parts of the country, is that historically we've had a very balanced and diversified economy. We don't overly rely on any one industry as the primary driver of economic growth or of employment. Naturally, there are pockets of industries that we have, more reliance or less reliance. I think of automotive manufacturing as one that's in the news a lot recently. But unlike Alberta, where a huge part of the economy ebbs and flows with one sector, Ontario was sort of built over decades to be a lot more resilient than that. We have massive industries that are headquartered in or around the GTA because there's a concentration of capital, there's a concentration of talent. And businesses can make decisions whether or not they want to operate here or elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the developed world. I mean, what we've seen is an increasingly uncompetitive environment for businesses. We see this in newer industries like software, where tech companies are disproportionately looking to move and relocate to the US. This even predates Donald Trump and the recent tariff fight. We see this in financial services, including Mark Carney's very own Brookfield Asset Management relocating to the U.S. Just uncompetitive business environment, predominantly driven by an overregulated and overtaxed corporate environment. And so, if you have a choice to locate your business somewhere else, we're increasingly seeing companies do that. Obviously, the most recent example of that is in the automotive manufacturing sector. I think there's a lot of trends contributing to that. But Stellantis made an announcement just in October around shutting down one of its plant expansions that was planned for Brampton, Ontario. That's being relocated to Illinois. We're seeing this in other segments that are not simply because there's a massive tariff being slapped on by the Trump administration, but just because it's getting harder and harder to start businesses and operate businesses. My wife, as an example, runs a business in the early childhood space. She runs a daycare in Toronto. Daycares across the country have undergone a massive change of policy over the last 3-4 years. But in Ontario, we've gone an extra mile of making the lives of these small business owners increasingly difficult, to the point where it just doesn't make sense to start businesses in those sectors anymore. So you're just seeing entrepreneurs give up, and shut down their companies or just not bother opening that second location or that third location. And I think that's really sort of making its way into just the ethos of the province. Now we're just becoming more and more a province of employees than a province of business owners and business starters and entrepreneurs, which I think is what you need. You need vibrancy in what used to be Canada's economic engine. We need to have people that want to take risk and want to deploy capital. And when that goes away, then there's a whole bunch of negative effects downstream.
Are there some specific policies that you can point to from the Ford government that has exacerbated the underlying productivity and innovation deficit problems?
Yeah, I mean, I'll point to there was a study just in September that came out of I forget the I think it's called IEM. It's a think tank out of Montreal. I forget the acronym. That for the first time in our history, Ontario has now surpassed Quebec as the leading province in corporate subsidies in the country. And so what Quebec used to have this sort of crown. They wrote the most checks to very targeted and specific industries and companies. Ontario has now blown past Quebec. The most obvious examples are places like the electric vehicle battery plants, where we've given billions and billions of dollars to very select companies in very select industries that are sort of like associated to a particular political agenda. Generally speaking, these are companies that are well connected. They employ the right lobbying firms, and they sort of get in close to the premier's office.
I call this the octopus economy.
That's right. And this is a policy that is not without trade-offs. I mean, like, we now spend over $9 billion a year in corporate handouts. And just for context, $9 billion a year redirected to corporate tax cuts would look something like a 5% corporate tax cut across the board. I'm not suggesting that tax cuts solves all problems, but yeah, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, how much money do you guys receive in equalization nowadays?
Yeah, well, I mean,
sorry, I couldn't make that. I couldn't let that one go by without slipping the knife in on that one.
Like to talk about that fact, but yeah,
no, they don't. They don't like to talk about the wealthiest province in the world as a have-not, or in the country as a have-not province. It's sort of a
And
sort of an interesting.
Unfortunate, like, this is something we're going to have to contend with as a province. I mean, I wrote a piece about this. I think it's coming out in the Hub soon on the Stellantis automotive announcement of shutting down or canceling their Brampton plant expansion. And one of the things that we're going to have to contend with is that automotive manufacturing, which used to be a massive employer in the province, continues to be a relatively large employer. Is going to have a very difficult couple of decades in front of it, not just because of the Donald Trump White House, but because the dynamics of that market have completely changed. I mean, the supply chains related to electric vehicles, the competitors coming out of Asia. This is not the automotive industry of the 1970s and 1980s. We are now competing in a market where we are just completely uncompetitive. And the only reason that we stay afloat in some cases is because of massive government subsidies. And what that means is that these companies, although they employ 100,000 plus people, they're net negative to our economy. They take more in tax dollars than they contribute back. And so, as it relates to productivity and our overall economic health, we're going to have to start realizing that we need something to replace that massive sector of the economy. And I think that's going to start happening faster than we originally anticipated, because now you layer on 25% tariffs from the US, and you're going to see every major automotive manufacturer face a lot of pressure to relocate some of that manufacturing capacity back to the US. So I don't think Stellantis is the last announcement we're going to see on that theme in the next couple of years. And we just don't have a good answer.
And yet it's still taboo to point out that the comparative advantage for auto parts and our auto manufacturing in Canada is increasingly not there. We probably shouldn't be sacrificing other areas where we do have a competitive advantage. Canola, ag, oil and gas, all kind LNG, these sorts of things. We shouldn't be sacrificing those I think stronger industries.
It's too comfortable and it's too easy politically to quote unquote save the existing employment base and the existing industries versus make room for new innovation, make room for new businesses. To try to predict what the economy of Ontario or Canada might look like in 20 years is an impossible task for government. It's an impossible task for anyone. But, I think when your default as a government is to think that your job is to dictate the way the economy grows, you end up with all sorts of bad consequences. And right now, we think we can direct the economy by doing things like writing checks to battery plants. And really all we're doing is we're getting in the way of organic growth that might have happened somewhere else.
Well, it seems to me like Ontario would be such an obvious place for, especially in the current political environment in the United States, where you have issues around visa holders and, high-skilled workers who aren't necessarily sure about where their employment situation is going to land them in terms of immigration. We should be taking advantage of that and creating some kind of free trade zone for tech or software development or whatever. Like, we could be incredibly mercenary in the current moment, but the will just doesn't appear to be there, or the imagination. I don't know what the problem is.
No, I think that's right. I mean, we have, in theory, a huge advantage as it relates to sort of, knowledge-based workers, whether that be in financial services, whether that be in software and technology. We still seemingly are satisfied with being, I wouldn't even say in second place, I'd say in often cases third, fourth, fifth place as it relates to like best places in North America to start a new business or start a software company. And I think there could be a huge change of approach that would actually unlock a lot of that growth potential. We have not, to your point, clued into the fact that the comparative advantages we had 50 years ago maybe look different today, and we're still latching on to some of these old sort of industry realities. But
yeah. Okay, let's talk about spending, government spending. Everybody loves to talk about government spending on a podcast. We live for that here. Presumably a progressive conservative government in Ontario. I mean, I am old enough to remember, what was the name of the Drummond Report? What was it? Oh gosh, I'm old enough to remember like 20 years ago when reports were coming out basically saying that Ontario's spending was on such an unsustainable path that if they continued up and didn't correct course, institutions were going to start to fall apart on us. How's that going? How's that spending going? How are your institutions holding up?
Yeah, we definitely like to spend. I think it's a convenient political tool. It's a lot easier to keep interest groups happy when you can sort of write a check. I mean, one of the biggest themes that we've seen in Ontario conservative politics over the last 7 years is this so-called shift towards private sector unionized labor. And I think, one way to view that is that's a really encouraging trend for conservatives across the country. Another way to view that is that we've just written the biggest check to these labor organizations to buy their support effectively. And I'm not sure that it sort of plays out in policy or in long-term durable support. But today we are spending more than we were not only on an absolute basis, but on a per capita basis than we were in 2018 and in the predecessor government. Even though a big part of the narrative when Doug Ford got elected was to get our finances under control, he still makes the case today that this government are prudent fiscal managers, which I think all evidence is pointing to the contrary. As recently as October, we saw this big fiasco with the Skills Development Fund, which is a massive grant program coming out of our labor ministry to effectively give money to folks that want to retrain employees in different industries. Turns out it's become a slush fund for well-connected companies and lobbyists to be able to effectively give access to, well-connected companies this funding. We love to spend money in Ontario. And so, and I don't think that's going to change.
So Doug Ford has not brought in the era of austerity that you might have hoped for.
No, and listen, I think people could debate whether or not a balanced budget is the ultimate and absolute goal of every government's agenda, but it's hard to characterize what this government has done as being fiscally responsible or fiscally prudent.
It's also interesting to me that like just balancing the budget now is regarded as austerity. Literally, just balancing the books is regarded as an austerity measure, which is pretty wild to me.
Anything that would equate our level of spending to our relative economic health. And I think our relative economic health is stagnating, but our spending is growing. And so, those two things are completely out of touch.
Can you give me a sense of what it's been like living in Ontario through a period of sort of economic stagnation? Like, I was last living in Ontario in my 20s, and it was a lot of fun back then. I was real cute. But, what's it like living in Toronto now as opposed to what it was like 15 years ago? Is it noticeable that the economy isn't doing as well as it could be? Because when I go to Toronto, there's lots of stuff that I see that I don't like, but there's still a lot of building, a lot of growth. There's a lot of energy. What's your perception as someone who's on the ground there?
Well, and listen, I moved out of the city a couple of months ago. I have 3 kids now and made the decision for my family to leave I now live in Georgetown. Which is, only an hour outside of Toronto or so, but very different, characteristic of a
Well, then get off my podcast and replace you with someone who knows better.
But I work in Toronto every day, so I'm currently sitting in Toronto.
Okay,
my office
we'll give it to you then.
My business is in Toronto. And I
mean, it's interesting that you can't live there and with 3 kids. I mean, that's certainly been my perception as well.
Yeah, that's probably where I was going to say you see it most directly, as you see it in the choices people are making in their personal lives, either to delay or not have families, or just unable to afford sort of the historic milestones that people would have typically associated to family formation, like buying a house. And so you're increasingly seeing the city being hollowed out of young people when they get to that age where they want to start a family, or of children. I mean, increasingly, I see parks in the city that have more homeless people than children on the playgrounds, and I think that's probably where you see it most blatantly. I don't think Toronto feels like it's in economic decline per se, because I do think relative to the province, Toronto is probably the one place that is still doing reasonably well. Our unemployment levels are reasonably low. But you look at any one subset, like let's say youth unemployment in Toronto, or youth unemployment across the province doing incredibly poorly. You go into secondary and tertiary markets in the province, and you're seeing significantly more acute impacts.
And this is the other thing I was about to say. It's like, no, if you're poor, you can't afford to live in Toronto. So if you're suffering from the economic decline, you're not living in Toronto. You're probably living in Kingston and Georgetown, and name a city, or name right.
Well,
so if you're going to see the actual impacts of economic decline,
yeah, you go to Windsor. Windsor's got 10% unemployment rates and rising. You might be able to afford a house in Windsor, but you won't be able to get a job in Windsor. And so there's sort of a catch-22. You can't live close to where employment is being created. And so that's having all sorts of sort of secondary social effects that I think we're starting to see increasingly.
I remember a couple of years ago, I was looking at potentially moving back to Ontario, decided against it for economic reasons. But we were looking as far away as Hamilton. And it was fascinating because you had this beautiful gentrifying area in Hamilton. Hamilton's a really cool town. Like it's pretty awesome. But then in those beautiful gentrifying neighborhoods right next to it, you had areas where I wouldn't feel safe letting my kids run around. And we looked at this and said, we can afford this level of a house in Calgary and have a nice suburban little house where we could let the kids run around, or we could live in the nicer parts of Hamilton, but we could never let our kids outside without keeping an eye on them, like for more money. Right? It's still more money. And it was just that the economic trade-offs of that were nuts.
Yeah. No, and I think a lot of people are making that decision. And there's two conflicting trends that are happening at the same time in Ontario. You're seeing that Ontario continues to be the largest recipient of newcomers to the country. People want to live close to Toronto for employment opportunities. So immigrants coming to Canada, often that ends up being in the sort of the inner suburbs around the city, because the city itself is becoming too expensive. But actually on a net population basis, we're seeing out migration at higher levels than inward migration. And so we're seeing more people leave Ontario for other parts of the country than people arriving in Ontario. And it tends to be a tale of two stories. I mean, on the one hand, immigrants want to live in Ontario. On the other hand, Ontarians are finding it increasingly unaffordable and unattainable to get the standard of living that they want. They're moving elsewhere. They're moving to Nova Scotia. They're moving to Alberta and other parts of the country. And so we're actually seeing population decline, by something like 100,000 people a year, even though we get 300,000-400,000 new people into the province every year. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and it's bearing out in all sorts of ways.
Well, and that's not necessarily healthy either, because you want people putting down roots, right? You want people to be established in their communities. You want them to be participating in their communities, joining the local boards, joining the local school, PTAs, doing that kind of thing. That's how you develop healthy, stable communities over time, right?
Yeah.
So having lots of people come in, but then just looking around being like, yes, this ain't it, Bob. That's not a healthy scenario for Ontario as a whole either.
But I do think, although it's particularly close for me personally because I work in the housing industry, but housing is one of these topics that, we've almost taken for granted that it's heading in the wrong direction and there's nothing we can do to solve it. The Premier likes to point to the Bank of Canada's interest rates as sort of the leading driver of our housing problem in the province, when in reality, the entire country shares the same interest rates by the Bank of Canada, but the rest of the country seems to be getting their act together, and we don't seem to be getting our act together. So, we continue to produce the least number of houses per capita. We continue to have the worst overall index as it relates to housing unaffordability in the country. And these are very intentional policy choices we're making. We are making choices that make it either too expensive or too prohibitive for people to build what they want to build where they want to build it. And naturally, when you have a lot of new people entering a province and you don't have enough new homes to accommodate those people, you're going to end up in a situation where homes become too expensive and people have to look elsewhere.
Yeah. All right. On that note, I'm going to say like and subscribe. Check us out, www.readtheline.ca. When we come back, I'm going to talk to Matt Spoke about school boards, education, social policy, and whether or not Doug Ford and his government needs to be more conservative in its approach to its governance. Check us out, www.readtheline.ca. So, Matt, at the outset, we talked a little bit about some of the issues that Project Ontario was going to be taking on. You, in a very tantalizing way, mentioned school boards being totally out of whack, and I'm here in Alberta, and my teachers are on strike. So, of course, this caught my attention. quite vividly. Can you give me a sense of what you mean by that? How are school boards completely out of control in Ontario, and how does it affect people's lives there?
I mean, I think what we're seeing now is the beginning of a conversation at the provincial government, and I'll give some credit to Minister Calandra, who's our Minister of Education in the province, for finally tackling one of these more challenging issues head on with the school boards. We're realizing that elected school board trustees in reality are very unaccountable to both the electorate or parents. And so it sort of begs the question as to what role should they play or do they play in our education system. I'm not sure about the system in Alberta, but in Ontario since the 90s, since the Mike Harris era, we've effectively had these elected school board volunteers that run at the time of our municipal elections, and they represent the school boards and they make sort of high level governance decisions as it relates to our school boards. These decisions have impacts in terms of like how funding is allocated, what type of, it's not curriculum based per se, but it definitely has sort of a social undertone in terms of the things that our schools are prioritizing. We've had schools and classrooms in Ontario where teachers have brought their students to pro-Palestinian protests in the last year, and you've got a whole bunch of grade threes standing in a protest downtown Toronto, and begs the question, like, who's overseeing these things, and what parents are actually asking for this. And you realize that fundamentally there are no parents that want this. This is just a school board system that is being run by activists rather than educators. And I think at the root of this is increasingly a sense among parents, myself included, that parents have no voice in the way that our education system is being run. I think the province is starting to clue into this, and they're saying, hey, at least if we took back some control from the school boards, we can theoretically be accountable to voters and parents in a way that the school boards are not directly accountable. And so we're now seeing the first of those fights. The province has decided to take on this fight with a handful of the biggest school boards in the province, saying, hey, we're going to actually put the province on the boards and replace the trustees with the Ministry of Education effectively. I think that's a generally positive step, but I don't think you solve this problem by tweaking on the margins inside the public education system, because ultimately I think the gravitational pull is always back towards the entrenched interests of the teachers union and the entrenched interests of like certain, typically left-wing groups that sort of dominate our school boards. So I'd like to see more.
For example, there were a lot of protests, particularly around transgender, gender identity, these sorts of issues. I mean, is that what's driving a lot of this movement?
I mean, I think the issue of the day changes, depending on, this year versus next year versus 5 years from now. I think the cause that animates the left is going to change all the time. I think a few years ago it was trans issues and bathrooms. Over the last 2 years, it's very much been the pro-Palestinian, cause and generally very like anti-Semitic rhetoric in classrooms and things like that. I think, some of these things they persist over time, but the level of attention and enthusiasm that goes into these various issues, I think, sort of ebbs and flows depending on what's going on in the broader context around Canada, around the world.
Isn't the correct answer that conservatives who have issues with those sorts of ideological agendas, they need to take up positions on the independent school boards? I mean, why is the answer to centralize more of that power in a provincial government, which I will remind you may not control in 3 years?
No, and that's where my fundamental criticism has been, is that, I do think that there's room to reform the public education system. I think the ultimate accountability comes from a competitive education system that includes other options that are not just the public school board. Alberta has a version of this. Quebec has a version of this. British Columbia has a version of this, where parents can make choices with their feet. They can choose to pull their kids out of public schools and put them elsewhere. Generally, in Ontario, the primary reason people don't do that it's unaffordable. So you're either choosing to homeschool your kids, or you're putting them into alternative schools or private schools or religious schools or whatever the case might be. You're sort of penalized for doing that within the Ontario education system, and you, in some way, are across the country. But I think the level to which we penalize that decision is very much up for debate. I mean, in British Columbia, you can get up to 50% of the cost of educating a child back in tax rebates to put them into a different school. So I think there's room to create more competitive pressure on our public education system. I also agree with you. I think, at the end of the day, you want accountability to be as close to families and parents as possible. I'm not sure elected school board trustees are the way to accomplish that. I prefer things like parent-teacher associations at the school level rather than at the board level. At the school level, you're a lot more accountable to the members of that community. People know each other. Parents are familiar with each other by face. They see each other at school bus pickup and drop off. School board trustees tend to be these nameless, faceless people on a ballot that you don't know what they stand for. You don't know what they believe. Nobody pays close enough attention for that to be an effective place. And so, in theory, you can say, let's run more conservatives for the trustees. In reality, they either wouldn't get elected or they still are a few degrees too distant from the ultimate parents. I mean, I think what the minister is doing that I don't mind is he's saying, hey, let's take some levels of governance back to centralize it in the Ministry of Education. And then let's empower parent-teacher associations more. Let's put more power in the hands of PTAs at the individual school level. I think that you get some better outcomes out of that, but ultimately I think you need to allow for more choice in our education system. And that's just not something that this government's been willing to entertain. And I think every time it gets raised, it gets brought up as this sort of like Americanization of our education system, when in reality there's lots of Canadian examples of versions of this that have been done well across the country.
So in Alberta, for example, I'll point out that we do have charter schools, which are not private schools. They are essentially, right, if you are a group of people who you want to have, you have a particular philosophy of education, whatever that philosophy may be, you can run your own school using the Alberta curriculum, but with a particular focus on math, arts, whatever, athletics, whatever you want. And then if you meet the standards that the Ministry of Education sets out, you can have that charter school funded to the same level that a public school would be funded. So the dollars follow the student. If you get 200 students to sign up for your charter school, you get the same funding that a public school with 200 students would get. So that's kind of how that works. Usually those charter schools actually can't charge tuition to parents. So they are considered public schools. The problem, of course, is that this is a very controversial thing even in Alberta. And of course, the second there's a teacher strike, who are the first scapegoats of the teacher strike? It becomes the private school system or the charter school system, because those are dollars that are being taken away from the public school system and thus starving the public school system. So, and I mean, many critics of the current system and people who are against the government right now basically assume that the government is operating in bad faith in its negotiations with the teachers because they have an agenda, an ideological agenda, to create an alternative private system. So it creates a friction within the system. So which is not to say it's a bad thing, but it doesn't solve every problem.
Yeah, and I think that's the right characterization of how this is typically framed. I do think, though, that like underpinning what you just described is this sense that the reason our school board or our school system exists is to sort of like maintain the interests of our teachers unions and our teachers, rather than looking at like what are the right outcomes for students and families. And I think if you reorient the way you think about this policy towards the family and the student, then like how the teachers union reacts should be the least of our concerns. Not to say that you don't have to navigate within the realities of how our school systems are set up, and there are collective bargaining agreements that exist and I think need to be respected. But we don't run a school system for the benefit of teachers. We run a school system for the benefit of students, and I think we often lose sight of that. And we're now seeing a very similar version of this starting to play out in our daycare industry, there's been versions of this. And the national policy around $10 a day daycare has been implemented in slightly different ways in different provinces. But what we're slowly starting to see in Ontario is what I would consider step one towards the nationalization of our daycare industry, an industry that has been historically run by private, one-off mom and pop owner and operators that started daycare in their neighborhood because they saw a need for their kids, and they signed up a whole bunch of other neighborhood kids. And now those business owners are sort of being squeezed out in favor of government approved, government subsidized centers. And it's happening from the opposite direction, but I think you ultimately end up in the same place. So yes, I'm in favor of more school choice, even though it disrupts the status quo. I think the reality is that the status quo is just not resulting in the best outcomes. Even our unwillingness to benchmark our students objectively based on standardized testing, because we're afraid of what the results of that testing would tell us. We're not only unwilling to benchmark our students, we're unwilling to benchmark the performance of our teachers. Every once in a while, this comes up in negotiations with teachers that we want to insist on some sort of like academic, rigor for our teachers to be able to pass a certain level of math qualification, for example. That qualified teachers in Ontario should be able to pass grade 9 level math, and that's controversial. I mean, these are teachers that are supposed to be primarily focused on educating our kids. So I think we're a long way away from the right outcome for families, and we had the largest growth in people leaving the public education system in the country during the COVID years and continuing to today. We're now at 7, coming up on 8% of students in Ontario that are educated outside of the public school system without any financial support, without any tax credit, without any charter. People that are making that decision to, effectively make a big financial sacrifice because they disagree with the way that their schools are being run. And so, I think there's something there. I don't think it needs to be all or nothing. I think there's a way to do this in moderate steps, but it's an important place to be focusing because ultimately how our kids are educated has a lot of impact in sort of the future productivity and performance of our province.
Okay, so I know you kind of want to avoid this conversation because it's a bit sensitive, and we want to focus a little bit on outcomes and how we can improve being outcomes. And I think that's less sensitive to approach it that way. But I do think that this Project Ontario is coming out of a group of people who have been disappointed by the lack of general conservativeness of the Progressive Conservative Party in power. So how do you think that those outcomes would be improved if Doug Ford and his government adopted a more conservative-ish ideology or mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't shied away from this. I know that we've been asked, pretty directly, is this a question of leadership, and is Doug Ford the right guy to sort of take the mantle that we're proposing and actually start to march in this direction? If there's one thing I'll say in favor of Doug Ford is that, when he feels public pressure, he is the first to sort of capitulate and change his tune on a particular issue, sometimes in the wrong direction. But I think that could equally be true in the right direction. If you say enough people start to put pressure on the government to change their approach to a certain policy file, I think that the premier would actually, at the end of the day, he wants to be popular. And if an issue becomes popular, he will move and sort of take up a new position on that issue. So I think what would that look like in practice for them to start, operating in ways that are more conservative? I look at it sort of 3 broad things that I ascribe to conservative ideology when I think about provincial politics. I think about education, healthcare, and the economy. There's obviously other issues, but these are central issues to what people look at our provincial governments to be responsible for in healthcare and education. And on economic growth, we can't pay for anything if we don't have a functioning economy. So, any conservative, whether federal or provincial, if you ask them their opinion on a more desirable educational outcome, it'd be what I just described. If you ask them their opinion on a more desirable healthcare system, it would be one where there is more choice, where there is room for, more than one payer, in this case, the provincial government, for a better functioning healthcare system. And all of that needs to be driven by a really high growth economy. And I think if Ontario is not leading the pack on economic growth, then the country suffers. So, I'd like that to translate to massive tax reforms. I think we need massive simplification in the way that we tax companies in this province. Our highest marginal tax rates at the individual level are north of 50%. I think we need to accelerate our push towards private delivery of certain parts of our healthcare system. We're seeing a little bit of that. But things like diagnostics and elective surgeries, right now, an Albertan could fly to Ontario and get a hip replacement and pay out of pocket. But in that same clinic, an Ontarian could not pay out of pocket for that surgery. I think that's just a silly outcome of the way the Canada Health Act was drafted. I think these things need to be revisited if we're not getting the outcomes we need, let alone access to primary care, family doctors, things
Potentially
like that.
they could fly to Alberta to get the help.
They could, and this is the irony. So, I mean, you can leave your province and pay for healthcare. You can't do it inside your own province. But
it's funny. So I mean, the thing that I just would ask about this is that from an Albertan perspective, what I look at Doug Ford is I see someone who's won an astonishing 3 consecutive majority governments.
Yes.
He has the best track record of any conservative politician in politics today. And I don't even think that's just objectively provable. Is it possible that he's not more conservative because that's not what Ontarians actually want? Are Ontarians, like a lot of Canadians, okay with things being kind of comfortable and kind of complacent.
I think there's some truth to that. I think he is a very good he's a good benchmark of what is the average Ontarian think. But I will say that if you dig beneath the popular, his personal popularity, because Doug Ford sits often around 50% in terms of personal favorables when polled. But if you actually
which is pretty good for a guy who's been in power for 7.5 years.
No, it's incredible. I mean, he's got to be the only premier whose favorables are increasing the longer he stays in government, as opposed to decreasing.
Let me tell you, Danielle Smith's more conservative, and I don't think her popularity rates are anywhere near that in Alberta.
And listen, you're right. And this is probably one of the things that makes him incredibly resilient to criticism, is that ultimately he can sort of fall back on that popularity. I think there's a bunch of contributing factors. For one, I think for the lion's share of his time in power, he's been able to very effectively point the blame towards Justin Trudeau. I think that period has passed. Now we're in a new period, and ultimately I think people are looking increasingly to the province to solve problems. So, the housing crisis, for some reason over the last 5-6 years, became a federal problem. I think this has always been a born in Ontario and provincial problem that we just conveniently passed the buck to the federal government and people bought it. I think the opposition parties in Ontario have been in complete disarray for an incredibly long time. And so there's been nobody effectively opposing the premier at the Liberal or NDP, within the Liberal or NDP parties. We're now seeing the Liberal Party going through a leadership race. We don't know what that will look like when they come out the other end, but I think there's more room for the Liberals to grow than there is for them to shrink. And I think that will start to chip away at Doug Ford's popularity. And I think when there was an Angus Reid poll back in August that started with this headline of his personal popularity, and then it dug into individual issues. On individual issues, this government performs very weak. Their polling results on cost of living, on housing, on healthcare, on education, people are not happy with the outcomes in these major files. But they don't ascribe that to be the premier's responsibility or the premier's fault, and so he still gets 50% personal support. But if the moment these things catch up, I think you reach a tipping point. I mean, we like to point to the UK Tories as a great example. I mean, the UK Tories were in power for 16 years, and ultimately things got caught up to them. The bad performance of that economy, of that country, caught up to them, and now they could be turfed to history. Now we're probably going to see a Reform Party get form in the UK. But after 16 years of saying, "Don't worry, we're popular. Don't worry, we're popular. Don't worry, we're popular," one day people start asking, "Yeah, but has my life gotten better during the time that I allowed you to be in power?" And I think there's a very hard case for this government to make that people's lives have gotten better. Maybe 7 years is not enough time for that blame to land at their feet, but I do think by the time you creep up on that decade in power as a premier, people start asking questions like, do we want to commit to more time with this leader? What are we getting out of this government and this leader? And I think the risk for the PC party is that the alternative becomes 10 years of Liberal or NDP rule as opposed to 10 more years, but under a new banner within the PC party.
Are you pushing for the Ford government to take up more conservative policies, or are you beginning the process of trying to renew a leadership cycle here?
My sense is in the medium term, I think this will ultimately lead to a leadership renewal, not because we have any direct ability to influence the premier out of that office, but I think that there is a natural moment in time coming up on a decade as leader where people are going to start asking those questions themselves. What we set out to do when we started Project Ontario was to start building the argument for, like, if we were going to redesign the PC party, what would we want it to stand for? What ideas would we want it to champion? What policies would we want it to be sort of pushing? And if there's somebody that decides to come out of the woodwork and lead, that party, I continuously remind people that the PC party is not the Doug Ford party. This party has to be bigger than any one leader at any one point in time. And so that party needs to think about its future post-Ford Nation. What is that party going to stand for? What are we going to champion? And maybe there will be candidates that come out of the woodwork, either from the federal party or people that are currently sitting in caucus or in cabinet within the provincial PCs that believe in what we're saying and stand for and agree with us on all these issues and are just waiting for their opportunity. Because I think right now there would be no opportunity to contest Doug Ford's leadership in any real way. But I think a year from now or 2 years from now, there might be, because I think we'll see a Liberal Party that maybe is in a stronger position. I think we'll see a few more scenarios where, Ford and his inner circle have put their foot in their mouths and they've done something stupid. And that starts to chip away.
We haven't even started to talk about the Greenbelt stuff now, have we?
That's right. I mean, there's a half dozen examples like the Greenbelt where, at some point these things catch up to you. And I think we just want to be in a position where when that happens, we don't want to be stuck with the next leader being appointed by, this version of the PC party. We want the next leader to be appointed by conservatives in the province who want to see a certain set of ideas reflected in their party.
Hear me out. Patrick Brown?
I mean, I think,
all right, on that note,
you're right in the sense that I think absent a movement like what we're trying to build, that is a very plausible next chapter of the PC party. And I think you need to build enough enthusiasm around change and let's do politics differently and let's stand for something. And, we hear this all the time from the current Ford people. We get elected. And, our response is always,
which he does.
If you get elected but accomplish nothing, then what's the point of getting elected, right? So and I think there's just very different, starting points in terms of like, what's the purpose of being in government?
Fair enough. All right. On that note, I'm going to let you go. Matt Spoke from Project Ontario. Where can they find you? Where can they reach you? Where can they sign up for your cause? ProjectOntario.ca. We're signing people up. We're just about to kick off another set of events. We hosted our inaugural event in Toronto. We're doing a province-wide sort of virtual event because we had a lot of feedback from people that couldn't make their way to Toronto that they wanted to be involved. And then we anticipate that we'll do a set of regional events across the province as well. So ProjectOntario.ca to learn more and to sign up. Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time, Matt. Really appreciate it. And check us out again, www.readtheline.ca.
That was Matt Spoke in conversation with the Line's very own Jen Gerson. If you want to learn more about Matt's project, go to projectontario.ca. And as for us, of course, as always, readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe. This has been another episode of On the Line.